So at last we come to the wedding night of Victor and Elizabeth. And here, Elizabeth, who has proven to be, as a character, a beautiful, wonderful, fantastic, understanding woman who has grown up with Victor and would suit him perfectly. Victor, on the other hand, has proven throughout the novel to be more and more unhinged as the novel goes on, more and more deranged. Why, for instance, has he said, I have no pride, and then turns around and shows that he's full of pride and everything's about him? Why is it that he keeps going away from society rather than trying to help people around him? Why, for instance, is he constantly saying, oh, there's a creature, there's a monster, there's a creature, when no one else ever seems to see that creature? It's something which proves there's a high possibility that he is himself demented, that he's insane, that he's mad. And that phrase, that sense that he's mad comes up frequently with other people thinking that he's crazy. Well, the wedding night comes, and on the wedding night, normally a couple that's married will consummate their marriage with physical contact, sexuality. And here, that doesn't happen at all. What happens instead is quite bizarre. The first thing to notice is that Victor speaks to Elizabeth and says, this is going to be a horrible night. Elizabeth observed my agitation for some time in timid and fearful silence, and at length she said, what is it that agitates you, my dear Victor? What is it you fear? Oh, peace, peace, my love, I replied, this night, and all will be safe. But this night is dreadful, very dreadful. So first he says that to her that the night is going to be dreadful, which is probably not what the bride wants to hear on her wedding night, and which does speak to his inability to deal with the physical world, with sexuality, with women, that he himself is so deranged that he sees the wedding night as a night of horror and terror. One subscribing to the vision of the machine within the machine, Shelley seems to suggest, has a great deal of difficulty, especially with dealing with other humans and especially dealing with the physicality of physical contact with another person. That sexuality becomes, in this way of looking at the world, something horrible, something truly monstrous and violent as well. It becomes violent. And Victor speaks to that violence when he talks about what's going to happen this night. I reflected how dreadful the conflict which I momentarily expected would be to my wife, and I earnestly entreated her to retire, resolving not to join her until I had obtained some knowledge as to the situation of my enemy. She left me, and I continued some time walking up and down the passages of the house and inspecting every corner that might afford a retreat to my adversary. So instead of going to bed with his beloved wife, he tells her to go into the room alone while he wanders up and down the halls with a pistol inspecting every corner for the creature. That is bizarre behavior, to say the least. It is deranged behavior at the worst. And while he's inspecting every corner of the house, he suddenly hears a shriek. Suddenly I heard a shrill and dreadful scream. It came from the room into which Elizabeth had retired. As I heard it, the whole truth rushed into my mind. My arm dropped. The motion of every muscle and fiber was suspended. I could feel the blood trickling in my veins and tingling in the extremities of my limbs. This state lasted but for an instant. The scream was repeated, and I rushed into the room. The moment he hears the scream, of course, he has this moment of terror, fright, and realization of what the creature intended. And there is a bit of the Gothic element here where it describes the blood trickling in his veins. But on the other hand, for him, recalling the event, to have described it in this way seems very odd, seems very strange, that he would have felt all inside of his body, all the movements of the blood and the coldness and all this at the moment of her screaming, rather than simply rushing in and helping her. When he does rush in, he sees her stretched out on the bed. She was there lifeless and inanimate, thrown across the bed, her head hanging down, and her pale and distorted features half covered by her hair. So he sees her on the bed, and she's straight backwards. It's much again like that Fuseli painting, The Nightmare, where we see the figure draped over the bed, vulnerable in either a swoon or a sleep or death, and the nightmare creature sitting on top of the lifeless body. And what he sees is her draped over the bed, and he immediately has a reaction to it that he faints. He passes out. Now, if you go back in the text to notice, he passes out when he sees the body of Clerval as well. He also passes out after he's destroyed the body of the bride for the creature. He also passes out earlier when Justine has been put to death. So he frequently is swooning or passing out, fainting. He goes into these fits whenever he sees the result of the creature's handiwork. Oddly enough, too, when he wakes up from his swoon, he's surrounded by all these people from the inn. And if you notice in the text, he's not in the room. Now here's a little catch-22, if you will, because he goes into the room and he sees the body and he falls down in a faint. He wakes up and he's outside the room. He's somewhere else. What happened in the time that he fell down in the room with Elizabeth right there and the time that he woke up? When I recovered, I found myself surrounded by the people of the inn. Their countenances expressed a breathless terror, but the horror of others appeared only as a mockery, a shadow of the feelings that oppressed me. I escaped from them to the room where lay the body of Elizabeth, my love, my wife, so lately living, so dear, so worthy. She had been moved from the posture in which I had first beheld her, and now as she lay, her head upon her arm and a handkerchief thrown across her face and neck, I might have supposed her asleep. So he wakes up, having fallen down in a swoon in Elizabeth's room, and he wakes up and he rushes back into the room. And she has been changed, the posture has been changed, so now she's lying down. Well, this is strange, it's very odd. This whole thing seems to indicate a discontinuity between the moment of seeing the body and then finding out later that she's been murdered. And when he looks at the body, he takes it into his arms and he's swooning over it, and it says, the murderous mark of the fiend's grasp was on her neck, and the breath had ceased to issue from her lips. So he sees on her neck the marks of the fiend. It's the strangulation. She had been strangled by the creature, just as William had been strangled and Clerval had been strangled. And again, if we see this creature as actually being Victor, you can just imagine Victor being the one who strangles all these people, this kind of demented, insane man strangling all of his victims and then later saying, oh, it was a creature who did it. And when he goes and looks at the casement of the window, he looks up and he sees the creature. And he shoots at it, and all the people come rushing in, and they think that he's nuts. So his father thinks he's crazy, the Mr. Kerwin thinks he's crazy, the people in the inn think he's crazy. One by one, we're getting other people in the novel who indicate that he might be crazy, nuts. And of course, if you come in and your wife has been murdered and you immediately say, oh, it was a monster who did it, and you rush out and shoot out the window, imagine that scene. People would automatically think that you were unhinged. And he, of course, has a reaction which even further concretizes the idea that perhaps he's not playing with a full deck. I was exhausted. A film covered my eyes and my skin was parched with the heat of fever. In this state, I lay on a bed, hardly conscious of what had happened. My eyes wandered round the room as if to seek something that I had lost. That whole image of his sickness, his swooning afterwards and searching around the room, is a scene of him, of madness, of him going mad. So he seems to, by all indications, be someone who is suffering from madness. That sorrow and misery he feels then is very much an indicator that he's filled with pride. He has a sense of his own swollen pride, his own self-importance. And when he goes back home, his father, hearing about the death of his daughter, dies as well. So Victor is like a pariah. He's like something that spreads death to everyone around him, causes the death of his father as well. He could not live under the horrors that were accumulated around him. An apoplectic fit was brought on, and in a few days he died in my arms. And I think it's almost humorous that his father dies in Victor's arms. You know, like Victor is almost like this looming, insane figure, and his father just happens to die in his arms, like everybody else seems to have died in his arms as well. And this sends Victor into a fit again, and he says, sometimes indeed I dreamt that I wandered in flowery meadows and pleasant vales with the friends of my youth, but I awoke and found myself in a dungeon. Melancholy followed, but by degrees I gained a clear conception of my miseries and situation, and was then released from my prison. For they had called me mad, and during many months, as I understood, a solitary cell had been my habitation. So after the death of his father, apparently everybody else thinks he's crazy, and they lock him up in a cell for, as he says, several months. So if we are saying he's crazy and there's evidence that suggests that, this is a direct pointing to the idea that he's crazy. Everybody else in the novel thinks he's so crazy, they actually lock him up in a cell. When he gets out of a cell, he goes before a judge to try and get the judge to search for this monster that he allegedly has loosed on the world. And when he goes before the judge also thinks that he's crazy. I repaired to a criminal judge in the town and told him that I had an accusation to make, that I knew the destroyer of my family, and that I required him to exert his whole authority for the apprehension of the murderer. I now related my history briefly, but with firmness and precision, marking the dates with accuracy and never deviating into invective or exclamation. Now, one of the things about madness is that frequently people who are insane, it seems, can remember things very clearly, or even in the fabricated world they've created, they have an accuracy of dates and times down to the very last detail. And Victor's remembering, as he says, the dates with accuracy and never deviating into invective or exclamation is almost like he's protesting too much his sanity. And if you're the magistrate and you're hearing all this, you think, this guy is really crazy. And that's exactly what happens. The magistrate appeared at first perfectly incredulous, but as I continued, he became more attentive and interested. I saw him sometimes shudder with horror, at others a lively surprise, commingled with disbelief, was painted on his countenance. When I concluded my narration, I said, "This is the being whom I accuse, and for whose detection and punishment I call upon you to exert your whole power. It is your duty as a magistrate." The magistrate, hearing this madman in his office raving about some monster, he sees that the guy is obviously going insane if he isn't already completely insane. And so he says, yes, okay, we'll certainly hunt after the monster that you tell us about. I have but one resource, and I devote myself either in my life or death to his destruction. And I trembled with excess of agitation as I said this. There was a frenzy in my manner, and something, I doubt not, of that haughty fierceness which the martyrs of old are said to have possessed. But to a Genevan magistrate whose mind was occupied by far other ideas than those of devotion and heroism, this elevation of mind had much the appearance of madness. And again, it's as though Victor, from the perspective of Victor, he sees the magistrate saying, oh, it's obviously thought I was crazy because he's such a plebeian, he's so beneath me, there's no way he could conceive what I actually have done. But if we were to look at it from another perspective, he thinks he's crazy because he is crazy. And one of the things you might notice here is there's very little sorrow, real sorrow for the death of Elizabeth. In fact, there's no ceremony for the death of Elizabeth. There's no sense of grieving for the death of Elizabeth. It's just immediately the misery and sorrow that I, Victor, am going through. And then Victor finally, at the end of the chapter, he proclaims to the judge in a way as though he were proclaiming to the creature. It was as though God talking to Satan or God talking down to his creatures. He says, "Man," I cried, "how ignorant art thou in thy pride of wisdom! Cease, you know not what it is you say." The very dialect he uses, the way that he speaks, indicates that he thinks himself superior, like he's above even the magistrate, like he has transcended above his fellow men and now is more lofty and sees things they don't see. Everything points to the idea that Victor is completely nuts in this point, and it is just a raving lunatic.